Now, as a first step, before we upload anything anywhere, we want to finalize our code. We want to polish our code and make sure it's optimized. That, of course, means that we want to test it. We want to test different scenarios and find possible errors in the code and fix them. We also might want to consider refactoring our code so that we don't repeat ourselves too often or that we solve a certain problem with less code. Because the less code you have, the less code the users of your website have to download before they see something on the screen. So less code means faster websites. And there's one specific optimization technique which I want to take a closer look at, and that would be asynchronous components, which are supported by Vue. Now, what is that? What are asynchronous components? I'm taking this course project, which we built earlier in this course, and you find that code snapshot attached in case you don't have that at hand. Here we have a bunch of components, a couple of components which we load as pages through the Vue router, and a bunch of code in general. Now, we can definitely test this and we can definitely refactor some code, but that's not what I want to focus on here. Instead, I want to focus on that async component approach. What do I mean with that? Well, there are certain components which we don't need every time this application is loaded. A good example could be that dialog which we see here during login. When we log in, we need it. But in the rest of this app, we don't use it too often, so we might not always need the dialog component. And the implication of that is that we don't necessarily need to download the source code behind that component all the time. Because as I mentioned, if users visiting this webpage have to download less code, that means the website can be used earlier. You don't have to wait for as much code to download. So the dialog could be a component which we can load lazily, asynchronously, only when we need it, and not in advance. Because right now, all those components, all pages and all other components are downloaded all the time, no matter if a user needs them or not. And that means we have everything available when we need it. That's great, but it also means we download a lot of code in advance which we don't need yet or which we might never need. And a similar example could be found for many routes here. The register as coach route, for example. For this user, since I already am a coach, I can't even visit it. So I definitely don't need the code for that. And that is something where Vue can help us. And let's start with that base dialog, which we don't need all the time. In main.js, we register this base dialog. We import base dialog from this file and we then register it. Whenever you have an import statement like this in the end tells Vue that the code in that file you're importing is needed. And you can imagine that all these imports are in the end, when you build your project, when you finalize your project, all these imported files are basically merged into one big file, kind of. That's how you can imagine this. So therefore, it would be great if we wouldn't import this. If we would only import it when we need it, then it would not be merged into this big file, but instead Vue would try to download the required code only when it's needed. And for that, Vue has a function we can use, the define async component function. With that, we can define a component which is loaded asynchronously, only when it's needed. Here, we could then create a constant named base dialog, so that I don't have to change the name down there. And the value I store in there is the result of calling define async component. Define async component wants a function. And here I'm using an arrow function. It wants a function that in the end then returns the imported component. But Vue will only call that function when the component is really needed. So here I can use the shorthand notation of arrow functions and call import, which also exists as a function like this in JavaScript. So it's not the import statement we have here. Instead, now I call import as a function. And when we call import as a function, that will only do that import when the surrounding code executes, which in this case is this function we pass to the define async component. Well, and this function is executed by Vue only when that component is used when it's needed. And with that, we ensure that the code of the entire base dialog component is only imported when needed. Now for that, we still need to provide a path to that component here to import though. But now with this dynamic import, we don't import it in advance, but only when it's required. And now we can still assign base dialog as a component here for base dialog, and Vue will know how to handle that when it needs to bring a dialog to the screen. So if we save that and reload, if I log out and log in, like this, we still see the dialog, so that still works. But actually the code is only downloaded when it's needed. And I can prove this to you. If I log out again and go to login and reload there, we can open up the DevTools, ignore the warnings here, and go to network. And now if you reload again, you see a couple of files that were downloaded from our development server. And one file you see here is this 0.js file. Maybe it's named differently for you, but you should see an extra JavaScript file next to app.js, which is your main app, and maybe this chunk vendors.js file. Now, if I log in, you won't see any changes in here, but if I now go to register as coach, if I now clear this network log and reload, you still see 0.js, but you see it only once. If I now clear this again and go back to all coaches, you see now here, that's where this file is actually downloaded. And 0.js, in the end, holds the transformed code for this dialog. Hard to tell if you look at this code here, but that is what you'll find in there. You see some hints at it here, like this name. So what I want to show you now is that Vue now checks the template of the components you're currently working with. And if none of those templates uses the dialog, it doesn't download the dialog. And the coach registration component doesn't use the dialog. Neither does the coach form or any other child component there. That's why here, if you're on this part of the app, Vue won't download the dialog. On the other hand, for the all coaches page, it does download it, because here on coaches list, we do use the base dialog. And that's a pretty neat feature. Now regarding that warning which I'm getting here, this might just be a bug by Vue at the moment, because everything seems to work correctly and we are definitely using the define async component correctly. Now we cannot just use the define async component for global components like this though. We can also use it for local components and that's pretty interesting, for routes. Because here, we probably got the biggest code splitting potential. If we never visit a certain route, fetching all the code for that route component and all the child components there is really redundant. So therefore here we can also use this define async component function. So we can import from Vue this define async component function here inside of router.js. And then we can replace the routes which are maybe never visited with asynchronously loaded components. For example, coach detail. Maybe a user never clicks that detail button. So then we can also set coach detail equal to define async component, passing a function to it, calling import there, and then pointing at this path. And then we can comment out this static import here at the top and just work with the dynamic one. We can do the same for, let's say, the coach registration. And that should be coach registration, as I see. We can also grab this here, call define async component, and import this dynamically, so that if the user never visits the coach registration page, we don't bother loading the code for it. So we can comment this out as well. And we can do this for all those components, or for most components, it makes sense, I would say. For a contact coach, for example, maybe a user never sends a contact message, well, then we don't need to load the code for that component and its child components. So that's another component we can turn into an async component. And why don't we do the same for requests received? Maybe this page is never visited. So therefore here, we can also load this lazily, asynchronously, and not all the time. So let's comment this out as well. And the same for auth. If a user is authenticated and reloads the page, we don't need to load the auth page again. We won't need it. So we can copy that and also load this lazily with async components. And comment this out as well. And you might find more places where this makes sense, but I will go with these components. And now also change the code registration name, which I mistyped earlier. And with this, if you save this, what you will notice is if you open the network tab, you see a bunch of chunks are downloaded here. You can ignore these chunks up here. You see only 0.js appears twice. And that's then the only extra code chunk which is really downloaded. So only 0.js appears twice. But for example, if I click on requests, we see 1.js was downloaded. So looks like this was the code for the requests received page. If I go to register as coach, we see another code file was downloaded. So now really the files are only downloaded as we need them. And that of course is very useful, because with that we can download a slimmer initial bundle and then only download the extra component code as we need it. And that's the idea behind async component, and that's therefore a key optimization step you should be aware of, especially when it comes to routing.